Hi guys. We've talked in our previous chapter, Markets and Systems, that human rights came as a response to universal threats. And then they started to expand in order to englobe other current issues and other factions of society. But why haven't the idea of these threats been realized as threats at their time before? Well, because it needed time for people who were abused to gain political momentum and fight for their justice. And this brings us to my chapter today, economic and social rights and their relation to the state. Now, at first, human rights emerged as a political and civil concept. And we ask ourselves, why haven't economic and social rights gained momentum at that time? Because people cannot fight for free education, social security, healthcare, and so on if they're dead or enslaved. So this is where we see the hierarchical concept of human rights and how they came at a place where they were required, where they came as a response to the threats at that time. But implementing economic and social rights are much more of a challenge to states than implementing political and civil rights. Two challenges arise. First, implementing political and civil rights can be done by legislation, or at least in theory, by legislation, laws, enforcement. However, implementing economic and social rights are rarely done through only legislation. And this is logical because the state needs to have a system of resource allocation, wealth distribution, building up institutions where the state has a primary role in providing economic and social opportunities for its citizens. Bringing us to the second challenge, that in order to guarantee political and civil rights, it's a much cheaper process than guaranteeing economic and social rights. Now, although what I'm going to say right now is not written in the chapter, but we need to understand the validity and the importance of economic and social rights. As we said before, human rights as a whole are indivisible, right? Right A completes right B in a specific manner. And the thing is, economic and social rights, they're important within their substance. Okay, as in, how can someone fight for freedom of expression and speak freely if they haven't at least finished primary education? Although this is debatable, I know, but you need basic requirements in order to implement political and civil rights. Another example is, how can we fight for proper democracy and the rights in voting, and people are starving, and then we ask ourselves, how do people sell their votes? At the end, how can, for example, people create proper and public associations if they're being enslaved at work? So now we see the interdependency between economic social rights and political civil rights, as in they don't only complete one another, they're vital for the existence of one another. So, and the thing is, we tend to look at them as basic requirements that should be understood and guaranteed by a specific legitimate actor. Some people say the state, other people say NGOs, IGOs, non-governmental actors, maybe international courts, although this is debatable. But in our chapter today, we have to understand the importance of being guaranteed economic and social rights, as in to think that these rights are not only guaranteed by the welfare state through a taxation system, and that they're completely neglected by non-welfare capitalist states. The author actually claims that this is too far away from reality because the Western debate, or the Western economic countries, view economic and social rights as objective enjoyments. They're already there. The debate is, how do they approach economic and social rights? So, for example, is how much and by what means resource allocation should take place. What rights should be given higher priority in the economic and social sphere? What means should be used in order to reduce poverty, in order to produce efficiently, for example. So the difference between the Western states is what role should the state play in regulating economic and social conditions, and where should the state draw the line? And how are they guaranteed? Well, I kept saying the state, the state, the state, so you guys should have guessed that they're guaranteed by the state. So, since all rights are merely political, and the state is the authoritative duty barrier that not only ensures that citizens do not violate another person's right, but also guarantees political, civil, economic, and social rights for its citizens through at least guaranteeing basic requirements. So the state is the legitimate, authoritative actor in implementing and guaranteeing, promoting, and fostering economic and social rights. Now, one asks, what if the state, and since we're giving all leverage for the state, what if the state fails in implementing its duty and in regulating economic, social, political, and civil rights? What if the state we're dealing with is Sudan or Libya? Do we shove into internationalism for enforcing that the state does guarantee its obligations? Well, if we turn into the Western approach, there might be some kind of interference from NGOs, IGOs, in, for example, attaining political pressure or sanctions on a certain country, or even going into international courts in order to at least make the issue famous. But in Western conceptualism, in theory and in practice, the state stays the central organizing actor because it is and it will always be the only legitimate actor in the international arena. Now, what the author mentions is that she tries to divert our attention on the fact that human rights application, applicability, and enforcement should remain a duty of the sovereign state. I mean, this is rooted in the social contract from the beginning, right? Because, at least in liberal theory, the state is a political society having narrowed self-interest, national autonomy, and national integrity. So in this reading, it's like we're focusing on the shell, okay? And the shell is unique, and the shell has the right to perform its own disjunction of human rights. This is how at least it's realized and understood in Western theory of how they see the relationship between human rights and the state. Why is the writer focusing on this idea? Because if we read at the beginning of the book, the idea is to understand what limits other states and actors from expanding human rights principles, and what limits them from standing against international violations by certain countries. And this goes to the core of human rights from the beginning. I mean, if human rights are not universally applicable by all states, then what's the point, right? Because human rights are universal and indivisible, and they should be applied to all. So if they're not implemented by other states, and worse, if they're violated by other states, and the state is the most regulatory actor in the international arena, what's the point? Why are we even trying? And if people are doubting that we live in an international system and that no, the state is not the only regulatory actor in implementing human rights, and we can see this by other NGOs like Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, and how much they play a huge and crucial role in challenging states that violate human rights concepts. Well, if we're going to take it according to this reading and to conceptual Western theory, we live in a society of states, and we've taken this before according to how Kantian ethics understands the world of states to be, and how Hobbesian understands the international arena, and about the English school of understanding the international system as a society of states. And the role of this pluralist idea of a society of states is in itself not to intervene in states' affairs and how to regulate its own affairs, but it's to facilitate the state's own realization of its purpose. So it always goes back to the state. It's not about solidarity or cosmopolitanism, even if we see how individuals interact internationally and globally, they are still limited by national boundaries and national interests. It seems like we've taken this before in other chapters and in other courses, but like it opens a bigger debate, much more deeper debate than the universality of human rights. It opens the debate of how should the state draw its own relations and its own interests according to human rights. For example, we ask questions as in, should the foreign policy of states harbor human rights principles? And if so, to what extent? Taking it in the lens of human rights when we're talking about humanitarian intervention, should it be the norm? And if so, where do we draw the line between interstate wars and intrastate wars? And this idea actually crashes Obama's "we should provide economic opportunities for other states" speech, because it won't be Obama's or any other country's responsibility to ensure that human rights are implemented and guaranteed, protected, and fostered in other states. Since we made this clear that states are the central agents in human rights politics, we gotta ask ourselves, how do states approach this? How do they approach this responsibility? With what means do they even approach economic and social rights? Well, we know in the international system, capitalism reigns and the global markets are the favorite and most preferable environment to foster capitalism. And let me set this thing clear, where even the welfare states prefer markets. They just prefer heavily managed markets. And even the international system even the institutions of the international system, all that Washington consensus good stuff like Bretton Woods and WTO and the World Bank, they all guarantee that states should develop through a capitalist system. Because, in order for a state to implement economic and social rights, it needs to have some kind of development, at least, in order to ensure basic requirements. And the market-oriented system, if a state chooses to be part of it, it would help it develop. And at the same time, it would help it induce its national income. And this is the core of the lesson, that economic and social rights rely on the state to adjust its own economic policies towards a more market-oriented system, because it would not only secure the victories and development of the state, but it would ensure that the state fulfills its objective in implementing and fostering economic and social rights. So at the end, the target of the state should be market-based and state-mediated in order to achieve a balance in implementing, fostering, promoting economic and social rights. So, after understanding that the state is the principal agent and understanding how it should approach its implementation of economic and social rights, and how a state, when it chooses to close its borders and not be part of the international system, as we've seen before in theory class, it steps away from gaining much momentum and development. And thus it fails to implement and guarantee its own citizens of their rights in the economic and social sphere. At the end of the chapter, the writer turns towards historical analysis of human rights principles and how they came upon being social practices. And she actually wants us to understand the falsification of the genetic fallacy, as in human rights are not Western generated values and principles. Even when we see how international institutions and human rights concepts may be emerged only for the sake of this argument and have been shaped by the West, but their applicability and appropriateness, if we want to achieve a universal human rights that are applicable to all, their applicability and appropriateness should be universal. And one thing's for sure, it's not the Western market, it's the global market. And human rights are not the source of one culture, because even if we start to believe that human rights are the source of one culture, then it makes it even harder for us to begin to see them as universal rights in the first place. And it makes the idea harder than it already is. And this is why the writer claims that understanding the history of it, of how these social practices emerged into being values and then human rights principles and how they became fundamental, allows us to examine our ability in making them universal, as well as examining the limitations that we face through cultural relativism, for example. And when we understand this, we know what we need to change concerning how we're approaching human rights in the first place. Especially when we started debating on whether we should enforce human rights on a certain culture or just let it be. Well, Daniel Bell's claim is, let's try and build on these cultures rather than just challenging them. Let's look at these cultures like through a case-by-case scenario, because this is the thing about human rights. They're human. They strive for diversity. They're different in how people understand them. They're even different in how would I understand them than how would you guys understand them. So human rights at the end, or at least how should we approach them, how should we see them, they're not the core of one culture. They shouldn't be the core of one culture. And at the end, they are a progressive social change. And this is where my favorite word comes in. It's the idea of human evolution, okay? And how people came to understand human dignity, to understand what is right, what is wrong, and whether the idea of something that's right or wrong should be universal or not is, well, we should develop this through our examination of how human rights came to be in the first place. At last, and in my opinion, in order to relate what I've said with economic and social rights, well, are the challenges of implementing economic and social rights just a matter of culture? Like states usually, especially states in the MENA region, they dismantle the responsibility towards implementing human rights as a whole, and especially economic and social rights. And they give several and various excuses, like resource shortage. Okay, we're short on resources. We're in debt, you know? How can someone provide economic and social opportunities if they're in debt? Or let's say like, okay man, look, we want to implement social and economic rights, but we're broke. Well, no. How I understood it from this chapter and from various chapters is that when a state dismantles its own responsibility in at least achieving basic requirements for its people, I mean, basic requirements should be at least fostering a healthy environment for students to learn, or in healthcare, or at least not making people evacuate their homes by force, or providing economic opportunities for those who are under the poverty line. At least these basic requirements, they are not due to resource shortage or being in debt, or because a country's national expenditure is much further than its national revenue or income. And it might be due to all these things and all these conditions, but we gotta ask why. Why is a state not allocating its resources or distributing its wealth equally, or at least through equity, it's because of poor and inconsistent political governance. I mean, the challenges for fostering, promoting, applying, and guaranteeing basic requirements of economic and social rights is political. How are political decisions made? So, this is something to think about.